Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome to Global Resources for Men. And we have today the one and only John Trager, located in Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. Everybody knows how much I love my Australians. So John is a mindset coach. He's a podcaster. He's an award-winning songwriter. He has done a lot in his just really wide-ranging life, from a regular 9-to-5 job to deep diving into his creative side to being a DJ at a strip club in Australia. So we have so many different things that we can talk about. John has experienced severe depression, suicidal experiences, and he has also experienced domestic violence. And so we are going to deep dive into some pretty intense conversations that are very real today. So hold on to your seats, and hopefully we'll have some of you deep dive into this with us. John, thank you so much for being here on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me on. What an intro. Like, now I just feel like, wow, where is this thing going to go? This is exciting.
You're very welcome. Yeah, so.
You extra guy.
Goodness gracious. There we go. I fixed it on the group who's still being. So you are going to give us all sorts of things today, talking about like some exercises of basically self-esteem and like emotional regulation, it sounds like, silver linings, things for people to look forward to more towards the end of our conversation. But first, John, tell us a little bit more just about yourself. Like, why did you become a mindset coach? Like, what happened there?
Well, look, it was one of those kind of accidental kind of situations where I'd been working a 9-to-5 job for years. During my 20s, I'd absolutely trashed my life with substance abuse and being in toxic, violent relationships. I'd been a songwriter. I'd just gone through all these things. And I think that when I got into my mid-30s and I conquered depression, I realized that there was probably an opportunity there to be able to help other people, because I just seen so many people around me that were suffering. And I'd sort of, through my own journey of sort of deep diving on what was causing me the depression and then how to think about things differently, I got to a space in which I really just wanted to help other people, and realized that coaching sort of came along. Mum gave me a call one day and said, "Hey, I think you should go and check this thing out. It sounds like you." Jumped on, went to a seminar, and I was like, this is exactly what I've been looking for. This is a great opportunity. And ever since, I've just been absolutely hooked on it.
Fantastic. How many years have you been coaching for now?
So I'm in I think about 2 years now, just under 2 years.
Yeah, everybody starts.
It's been, absolutely. And it's been such a journey, getting to work with different kind of people who perceive the world differently. It really opens up your own mind quite often when you're talking to someone. You're like, oh, okay, that's an interesting perspective. I may not have seen it that way. How can we look at it different?
I love that you just brought up how we can look at things differently, right? Because there are different attachment styles, different love languages. Multiple intelligence theory shows us that there are 9 different ways for us to process information. So 2 people.
Wow.
Yeah, 2 people could actually like literally agree on a subject matter, but because you assimilate information differently, you can literally just sit there and argue round and round and round, because you can't take a step back.
Absolutely.
Just shift. And how can I explain this differently? Obviously, the person in front of me isn't getting the information. And then you're like,
yeah, look, and I think that happens so often too, is that we'll be having a conversation with someone and we'll be talking about something, and we don't actually realize that what it is that we're talking about, we've given a certain meaning to that. Right. And so I think quite often, when we're communicating with others, there's a miscommunication quite often, because we talk in context, or in concepts, I should say, and we think that the other person has the exact understanding of that concept that we do. And then, we start talking, and the next minute there's something that's not gelling, and it's because of people's different perceptions on things.
Absolutely. And then you have the cultural aspect of things as well, right? And now that technology allows us to speak to people like literally all over the world. And
really, look at us now,
Right? American Australia. Time for you, it is bright and shiny early for me.
Absolutely. I'm about to go to bed, and you've still got your PJs on. Should I tell the viewers that or not?
It's the pandemic. Who hasn't done a Zoom call in their pajamas, basically? It's all about comfort.
Absolutely.
Professional from here up, it's fine. Tank top's professional. It's fine. I still brush my teeth though, even though people can't smell my breath from here. I think it's funny. But you know, that's an important part of hygiene and your health routine in the mornings. It's what you do.
Oh, absolutely. You need routine for sure.
So, John, you've experienced some pretty considerable things in life in regards to struggles. So you told us a little bit about the severe depression. What brought that on, if you don't mind sharing with us?
Oh, well, this is one of the things that I've sort of asked myself so many times over the years. You know, I had a really happy childhood. I grew up on a small farm. We had exotic animals as well as all your traditional kind of animals like horses and cattle and sheep and that. Really two supportive parents that just loved and adored me. And then by the time I got to high school, I'd probably dealt with a little bit of bullying over the years. And I got to about 16 or probably 15 and just this cloud consumed me of anger and depressive thoughts, which then eventually led to me having my first period of being suicidal. And I've sort of taken some time over the years to try to reflect on this now that I'm out of that state of how did this actually start? And the only answer I can ever come up with is this idea that I was quite a sensitive kid. And so as a way of protecting myself from disappointment, I created this theory in my head that if I thought negatively, I couldn't get hurt. So for example, if I was going to play sport and I thought we're not going to win this, you know, and we did win this, it'd be like, yay, we won this. But if we didn't win this, then I was expecting that anyway. So in theory, that seemed like a really, really safe way of protecting oneself who was sensitive. But ultimately what happens is we recognize now, you know, with cognitive bias and our focus and our negativity bias and all of those things that come into play, when you start focusing on the negative thing all the time, you start to draw more of that into your experience. And I think ultimately that's probably where the depression stemmed from, was the fact that I was just thinking so negatively about everything around me, about myself, the negative self-talk, and just, you know, started to just accumulate to a point in which I guess I just felt worthless.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And did you feel like anybody saw you in your struggles, or did you just feel totally unseen and unsupported?
Well, I think this is one of the sort of the fascinating things is when we start talking about the masks that we wear. You know, quite often when we go to work, we chuck on a mask, and we've got around our family, you know, we would like to be authentic, but we still wear masks.
Yeah.
And I think for me, because I was sensitive and not wanting to draw attention to the chaos that was going on inside, on the outside, I was this bubbly, eccentric, egotistical kind of character that was just, you know, almost like the class clown. But inside, the story was so very different.
Yeah. What kind of things do you feel like compounded it? Like, how did that push out into the world as dysfunctional patterns with your engagements with people and relationship, do you feel?
Well, I think that because I wasn't able to manage and regulate very well, you know, especially during those teenage years where you've got so many hormones racing through your body and you're so impressionable, and, you know, society is having such an impact on you and your friendship and your community and all of this pressure and of what you should be and who you should be and how you should think and act and all this, and parents telling you this, that, because I couldn't emotionally regulate very well. And I was thinking negatively quite often because I wasn't able to slow things down, take control of my emotions. My words were quite hurtful to people. My actions become quite erratic. And I think that affects a lot of your relationships ultimately around you when you're in that state of saying things that you're like, oh. And for me, you know, I used to go to bed and sit there for hours and I would review my day in my head of, oh, why did I say that? Well, you know, next time I got to make sure I say this. And I wouldn't sleep for hours, you know, because I'd be sitting there so beating myself up for all of these things that I'd done because I just ultimately didn't know how to emotionally regulate.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I hear you. When do you feel like that aspect of drugs came into the equation?
I'd always sort of been frightened of drugs. My mother was a nurse when she was younger, and she'd said to me, don't touch this, you know, this will happen to you, it'll mess your brain up. And I stayed away from drugs for a long period of time. But like a lot of country people, you know, alcohol was something that probably arrived first. And that was one way that I probably numbed a lot of the pain in, you know, my probably 18, 19, early 20s. And it wasn't until probably 23, 24 that I started smoking marijuana. And then ultimately that opened up to other drugs and other ways of regulating, or at least numbing myself and escaping.
Yeah, no, that's story sadly for so many that are out there to try and cope that don't have the support that they need. And
And I
then,
think that's what's hard too, especially with alcohol, because it's so socially accepted
right,
that, you know, when you talk about being, you know, a substance abuser, and whether you're doing, you know, marijuana or speed or coke or whatever it is that you're doing, those things are frowned upon, like, you know, you're really out of control. But people don't realize that, you know, there's been far more social issues that stem from alcohol than ever have from marijuana and a lot of other drugs.
there's a lot to unpack, and certainly
Oh, absolutely.
so many things to unpack societally around all of those pieces, especially in Virginia where I'm at. Marijuana just became legal on the 1st of July, to one degree at least. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to watch how society has been navigating that in this particular area.
Well, that was one of the things that I'd never sort of, you know, it wasn't until I went to Amsterdam and I looked at Amsterdam, and I'm a bit of an observer. When I travel, I like to watch things. And I watched Amsterdam and I was super impressed by the way that they managed things over there, because they hadn't had it as this taboo thing they were trying to hide away. And they recognized, I guess, that marijuana wasn't having the impact that heroin and the other hard drugs were. By legalizing it, it allowed them to focus their attention on those hard drugs. And Amsterdam, to my understanding, has the lowest heroin rates in the world because of it. And also their prisons, like they're starting to turn their prisons now into youth hostels, because they've just done so well at managing, you know, social issues.
Fascinating. When you were in that space and time and you noticed that you had become an addict, what were the steps? Like, did you have somebody in your life that had stepped into that role that said that, hey, you seem to really be struggling, how can I help you? Or did you do that on your own? Like, what was the transition period?
I would say, I guess, to be clear, for me, I experimented with a lot of drugs, but marijuana was always the one that I came back to because my mind's quite erratic. And what I enjoyed about it was that it slowed things down and I felt like I could be in control. The process of going from being full on addicted, and during the days of being a full on addict, you know, my partner and I were smoking $300-400 a week, like around the clock. I would wake up, be smoking, go and do my job, come back, and you become a functioning addict because you're consuming it so often. It doesn't have the effect that it normally has on people. And it took me probably, I would say, a good 8 years to work through the process of being able to overcome those addictions. And I think the key for me is ultimately having a massive why. I think this is the key for any kind of change that we want to make in our lives, is having a massive why. And I think there's two aspects to this too, because quite often we think about, you know, you shouldn't do things for others, you should do it for yourself. You know, you have to do it for you. What is your why? But the research actually suggests that when we do things for other people, quite often we're far more successful at doing that. So if you can prop both of those up and have two massive whys, where you've got one for yourself, why do I want to do this? And for me, one of the reasons I wanted to do it was that I wanted to get super clear. I wanted to get healthier. I wanted to be able to help people. And I felt that I couldn't do that when I was under the influence all the time. And I also, you know, had people in my life that I loved and adored who didn't want to see me like that. So I had two whys. And over a period of time, I eventually worked my way into a place where I didn't feel I needed it anymore.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's quite the journey.
You're welcome.
During that time period, when did you get into DJing and like shifting into that particular job? And I imagine that there was probably an overlay of your being an addict and experiencing domestic violence.
Yeah, well, look, I guess I went through the template. I tried to do the life that everybody's expected to do, where you get the partner, you buy the house, you have the job. And by 24, I got to my second period of being suicidal, where I was living alone in this house. I'd come out of a relationship, And I would literally wake every morning with these panic attacks. And every time I'd jump in the shower, as soon as the water would touch my skin, I'd just start crying uncontrollably. I didn't even know why. And everything was just this walking around in this haze. And I would just feel this pain inside me, like this is never going to change. Like, you know, I don't know how not to be depressed. And I got to a point where I now in hindsight recognize that I'm a bit of a control freak. So when I was going through those periods of being suicidal, I had basically come up with a plan as to how I would do that. And when I kept going through and pushing until I just was exhausted in the end, I was just like, this is just never going to end. I don't know how to get out of this. And luckily for me, I was in a stage in which I woke up that morning and I was going to cupboard to get those items out that was going to end my life. And I just thought I got to do something. And I just rang a mate. And luckily for me, he answered. And I just cried on the phone for probably an hour to him. And the irony of it is, in hindsight, that it was probably the least emotionally intelligent mate I could have ever found. But he didn't need to say anything. He just needed to be there whilst I cried. And he'd say to me, mate, you know, just cheer up. I'm like, mate, I don't know how to. And this happened for a whole week before he sort of said to me, mate, you've got to talk to a professional. Like, you know, this needs to be discussed with someone. And even at that stage, being a man once again and feeling that shame of how do I talk to someone about the way I'm feeling, I wrote a note to my boss. I didn't know who else to talk to. And I wrote a note and said to him, look, every day I go home from work, I just want to end my life. And he sort of read it. And once again, he was an accountant. So he was very black and white and not the most emotionally intelligent guy out. But he, luckily for me, he took action and he got the company chaplain involved. And we sat down and had a conversation. And he listened to me. And in the end, the only advice that he could really part with me was that no one's coming to save you. You have to take responsibility for this. And at that stage in my life, I didn't really know what that meant. But I interpreted that, you know, I need to take responsibility for my life. I'm living this template. I need to do what I'm really passionate about. So I went home and I wrote a list of the 3 things that I wanted to do the most. Number 1 was rock star, and number 2 was radio announcer, and number 3 was writer for Rolling Stone. And I thought, which one's the easiest one to do? I'll have a crack at the radio announcer one. So I enrolled in radio school, went to radio school, got offered this job a million miles from home. And my father wasn't well at that stage and he was in his 80s and I didn't want to go that far. And so I jumped onto Seek and I typed in radio announcer, and here comes this job as a strip club MC. And so I just went along and they asked me to speak on a microphone, and I spoke, and he said, speak some more. And I spoke some more, and he said, okay, you start on Wednesday. And I was like, okay, cool. Let's do this.
It's a great story. And what was that like stepping? How old were you again when you stepped into that role?
At that stage, I was 24, and you got to remember that I was a real naive country boy too. So I went from living in this small country town of about 8,000 people to moving to the city and working night shifts in a world upon a world. So strip clubs are like the opposite to reality. So in reality, you know, lawyers and accountants and those kind of people are respected in society. But inside there, they come in coked off their head, having done 80-hour weeks, and they just cause trouble. But inside those walls, like your drug dealer, gangster types, those guys are kings in there. And in the outside real world, you wouldn't give them 5 minutes and you try to avoid any kind of interaction. So for a naive country boy to walk into a world that had just turned itself upside down, I was like, where the hell am I? And what am I going to do here?
Right. Yeah. And then you met a woman that worked there.
Yeah. Well, when you're working 6 nights a week and a lot of your hours on the weekends, you don't really have a lot of opportunities to get out there and socialize. So what do? You start dating people that you work with. So I started dating a dancer, and I don't advise that people work with their partners. Like, I'm sure there are people out there that can do that really successfully, but yeah, that wasn't my experience for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine too, like in that environment and watching people engaging with your partner in that way would be a bit difficult.
Yeah, look, you definitely learn to compartmentalize the person. Obviously in clubs, quite often the dancers will go under different names. So that made it easier for me to compartmentalize, this is the dancer and this is my partner. But look, it definitely, if you're a jealous guy, you would really struggle under that situation. And even now I think about it, I'm like, wow, how did I disconnect those two so well? Because I did manage that so well. But yeah, ultimately that was then the start of a lot of chaos, where I had been going thinking I was taking responsibility for my life and had this dream job that all of a sudden, the day I started, I had like 700 new male friends that were like, hey mate, I haven't seen you for ages, I'll come down and see you. Yeah, no worries. But then ultimately, once I started to get into the feel of it, as I said, it's a whole different world upon itself. And you'll go into your manager's office and he's doing lines of coke on the table, and that's just the norm. And he's like, do you want one? And you're there.
Right.
And that becomes just what your life becomes. So the other thing too was that they would allow me to drink as much as I wanted, and it was all free alcohol as long as I could still articulate myself and do my job. And so you can imagine, when you're in a place when you're surrounded by beautiful naked women, you're doing drugs, you can drink as much as you want as long as you can stand and talk, you do start to spiral out of control very quickly.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And just like the energy, I imagine, that would be in that kind of place, vibrationally, and would make things harder too.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, my partner, the dancer, she had a borderline personality disorder, and this caused quite a lot of chaos in our relationship, which then eventuated into, quite a few moments of domestic violence.
Yeah, and domestic violence, I feel like, it's a hard situation no matter what your gender is or what the situation is. But I think specifically for men, there's an additional layer of what it's like to engage with domestic violence and being hit by a woman, and like the stories that you're told, like, don't hit women, like you were telling me about for your dad. So tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you and how you were able to move through it.
Well, I think for me, it's interesting, and this is probably in hindsight that I realized what I was really doing was, in those moments, I felt like if I just kept supporting her and kept loving her and giving her everything that I had, that ultimately that would change her. And I think that, anybody who's got a few runs on the board recognizes that we ultimately can't change anybody, that it has to be up to the individual to change. And I guess the other thing that I have to take responsibility for is that I use those moments of a way of avoiding having to deal with my depression. When you're with somebody who is experiencing more chaos than what you are, it makes you, for a better of a word, feel more normal about yourself. And so I think that in hindsight, it was really an avoidance strategy, of one that I didn't really talk about with people, because as we discussed, quite often, and especially with men that are in situations of domestic violence, there's a lot of shame. And how do you tell your mates, hey, my partner's, getting violent with me? And we spoke earlier before we went live, which was that, you go through these moments where, my father had programmed me right from day one that you never hit a woman under any circumstances. And when you're being physically attacked and you can't defend yourself, that then creates a lot of chaos in one's mind. And those were really challenging years.
Yeah, and you were telling me you hit the floor.
Yeah, so I was in a situation, and I was about probably 27. We'd go out and we'd get a hotel room and we'd just party in the city and that. And we'd had a few drinks this night, and I can't remember exactly how things got out of control. It's difficult. Sometimes it would be just so quickly that it would happen. And I found myself in a moment where I was down on my knees and I was defending myself while my partner was standing above me, just, physically attacking me, and having that chaos of my father's words in my head, you can't hit her. And yet your fight and flight is starting to kick in, and you're getting all this aggression in your body because you're being attacked. And I didn't really know what to do. I was just in this, space of feeling lost, and whilst this intensity was building in my body, and just as a simple release, I literally got my fist and I pounded it into the floor and broke my hand in 2 places, because I just needed to release all the energy that was coming into my body.
Yeah, that's a lot. What is some guidance that you could give men that are potentially in the same sort of situation that you were in regards to domestic violence, like some resources or advice, since you were able to get yourself out of that relationship and into a healthier place?
Look, I think ultimately it comes down to simply that at that particular stage in my life, and quite a few men will probably get deterred by this term, but I just didn't love myself. To allow somebody to physically treat you like that is showing that you don't have boundaries, your needs are not being met, and that it's no longer a healthy relationship. And I would advise anybody who's in that situation to just consider getting out of that relationship for sure.
Yeah.
And that can be really tricky because, I loved my partner so dearly. But as I said before, like in hindsight, I recognize now that I was using it as an avoidance strategy to have to deal with my own stuff that was going on inside.
Yeah. I wonder that if for some men out there, if it's not that aspect of wanting to save their partner to protect them, because there's that natural role as men that they want to be the provider, they want to be the protector. And if that person is in more chaos than they are, right, stepping into that role and be like, you're so desperate for the opportunity to fill that role, to feel it within yourself, that you'll put yourself into a toxic situation in order to step into it.
Absolutely. And look, John Gottman from the Gottman Institute, who's an American social researcher, quite often talks about men wanting to fix things. Whenever they've got their partner who's having an emotional reaction to something, their automatic response is, I need to fix this. How do I fix this? And I think that was very much part of what was going on for me as well.
Yeah. So how did you manage to get yourself out of that situation?
Well, look, I guess, ultimately I found myself in a situation where my partner was unfaithful. And that was where I was able to draw a line and say, okay, there's no trust in our relationship anymore. And I think it's time to move on. So, I've spoken to a lot of men about this and they're like, holy crap, dude, like, how did you deal with the fact that you'd been through that? And then for that to occur. But for me, I was starting to get to what we'll talk about later on, finding the silver lining of being able to start reframing my thoughts. And instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I started realizing what I had, which was, I'd got out, this is not probably the right term, but it felt like a get out of jail free card, where it was like, okay, now I can move forward from here. And that was challenging because at that point in my life, when I got out of that relationship, I'd been in a toxic relationship. I was severely depressed. I was a substance abuser. I was $60,000 in debt. And, I'd lost my father 18 months ago before that moment. And he was basically my hero and my rock. And I was lost, to be honest. I was completely lost.
Yeah, I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And you've had a healing journey now, and you have a beautiful life with a partner and a daughter. And so tell us a little bit about how you were able to transcend those spaces and heal and come to a place where you've had a really beautiful, functional relationship.
Well, look, I think it was probably a 6-year period that this happened, to go from that space of being at absolute rock bottom to building myself into a place of self-acceptance, having strong boundaries, recognizing what I wanted in a partner, and then being able to find that person was a series of steps. And I think personally, if I reflect, the first step was having to take responsibility. And as I said before, the company chaplain had said to me, you need to take responsibility. And 4 years later, it finally dawned on me to what he actually meant. The experience I was having, the depression and that, I had to take responsibility for the way I was feeling. So for me, I asked myself, this was the first time, 15 years I'd had depression. I asked myself a different question. Instead of saying to myself, I don't want depression, I don't want depression, I don't want depression, I asked myself, well, what do you actually want? And the answer was happiness. And I thought, well, how do I do that? So for me, as soon as I was really clear on what do I actually want in my life, and this depression has caused me to absolutely trash my life, and then started focusing on the fact that happiness was where I wanted to be, I then started looking, I guess, for resources to become happy. And it was a period of time in which I had to, I read the Dalai Lama's The Art of Happiness, which, to sum that book up in one word, it's gratitude. And that's when I started to change my focus. And so for me, when I was depressed, I would look at the world and I would look at all the world's problems and I'd see, what's the one common denominator here? People are. And then when I realized that I wanted happiness in my life, I just knew that, okay, I can no longer think like that. I need to now start loving people and finding beauty in people. And this is where we go to, reactivity, the RAS, which is our focus. When you start changing that focus from looking at all the problems in the world to then going searching for people that are doing amazing, beautiful things, that have compassionate hearts, there's millions of them out there. And I just hadn't seen them before, but then they become part of my awareness. And I started looking at those people and I started to examine them. And, part of the journey was I traveled overseas and I went to countries like Bali and India and Sri Lanka and Nepal. And I started to go to poor countries and I started observing these people that had nothing. And yet they were far happier than me or the kids that I was seeing in these developed countries. And I kept thinking to myself, what's going on here? Like, why are they so happy? And so I started to engage with the locals. And once again, bang, right in my face, gratitude. They were grateful for what they had. And that was such a turning point for me, because at that stage of my life, I was living in St Kilda, which is a suburb in Melbourne that has quite a lot of social issues that are very much out on the streets in front of you. Yeah. So I had this ability to be conscious all the time when I would see homeless people and go, I am so grateful for the fact I've got a roof over my head, I've got food in my stomach, I've got heating, just the basics. And that's where it started, which was to start to be really grateful for the small things. And once again, like the theory that I've come to about my depression of thinking negative, as I started to focus more on being positive and, being grateful, and then reframing moments, and then ultimately learning how to emotionally regulate, my entire reality changed. The things themselves did not change, but the way in which I felt about them changed. And then over that 6 years journey, I found myself probably by 2019, I was in a really strange situation where I had some surgery and I got part of my colon cut out and I had a lollipop stick stuck in my colon. Now, please don't ask me how it got in there because I still don't know the answer to that question. But I woke up from this surgery after 11 hours of surgery and I wasn't sure what was going to happen going into that. And I woke up and I just laughed. And I was like, this is hilarious. I've got this weird story that's going to be a gem for years to tell. And I'm still here, universe. So let's stop messing around and let's start making something really happen and start to live a more fulfilling life. And that's when I sort of realized that the depression was gone, because that would have been a moment, especially when you're in a hospital for 15 days and you've got doctors coming in day after day going, hey, dude, are you in pain? And I'm saying, no. And then the next day they're coming in saying, are you in pain? And by the third day, I'm like, okay, what the hell is going on here? They're like, we don't know. Your white cell count is just out of this world. And, they're keeping you in hospital and they're going through all this stuff and there's so much uncertainty. This would have been a perfect time for me to just fall to pieces and to be depressed. And I just felt so good that I was alive, that I was like, okay, what are you going to throw at me next? This will be just another interesting part to this story I've got to tell.
Yeah, no, I love it. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I actually made a bit of a game of it at one point, because I guess to give more context, I lost about 30 kilos over 2 years and the doctors couldn't tell why. They thought I had cancer at one stage. And obviously that starts to create a lot of chaos within the mind.
Sure.
And then
Maybe it's just a lollipop.
Yeah, well, look, I went in for one day, and this is getting a little bit graphic, but I went in for a colonoscopy, and I woke up from the colonoscopy, and the doctor said to me, "No cancer." And I'm like, "Boom, that's awesome." But, and he shows me this picture of this yellow thing, and he's like, "There's something stuck inside you." And I look at him really strangely, and he says to me, "So you can tell me, what have you been putting up yourself?" And I said, "Look, doc, I haven't put anything up myself." And he said, "No, don't be funny about it. Look, I've seen it all, Coke bottles, this and that." I'm like, "Doc, I'm one of the most open and honest human beings you will ever meet. If I was placing things inside me for sexual gratification or any other reason, I would be more than open with you about that." And so he looked at me confused. I looked at him and confused. And that started this journey of eventually finding out that I had a lollipop stick stuck in my colon. So laugh away. Look, these
Great.
are the bizarre things.
I know you can handle it. It's very funny. And now and speaking of laughter, you have the Trixie Trager talk show. How did you get
Yeah,
into
it's
this fun sort of podcast that people can follow if they want some more
well,
laughs?
as I said to you earlier that, radio announcer had always been something that I was really interested in and had gone to radio school. And it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, I sort of realized, well, hang on, don't need to be a radio announcer now that we've got podcasting. It's so easy to do. I'm a musician. I got a portable studio. Let's do a podcast. And I thought to myself, I started doing research, and a lot of the research suggests find a niche, niche down, get a topic that's really specific. And I thought, what am I doing this for? I'm doing it because I love broadcasting. So I thought to myself, what is the most generalized topic that I can find in the entire world? And ultimately realized that we all have to use the toilet. And I thought, let's do a podcast on toilets. It connects us all. And over the years, toilets have been a magical place for me, because what I found, I know it's going to sound funny, but what I found is
following it up from the whole like colonoscopy and yeah, well, it's just a perfect segue.
well, exactly. But what I've found that is toilets, and I promote this with all of my clients, are a magical place for managing one's mental health. So when I was in those periods of, strong emotional reactivity and I needed a place to calm down, the toilet was a good place to go to, because no matter whether you're at work or whether you're out at a festival or a friend's house or wherever, there's always a toilet around. And it's a great place to go and just get perspective. And it was also, there was a job that I was doing at one point that I was feeling very unfulfilled and I was having a lot of depressive states in. And I'd be sitting at my keyboard and I'd be like, oh boy, how long am I going to have to do this for? And as a way of managing my mental health, because this is when I was trying to become very conscious about my emotional experience and the energy that I was projecting, I would get up from my desk, I would go to the toilet, and for 3 to 4 minutes, I'd just rip out a bit of air guitar and pretend that I was like, on a stage and living the dream, rock and roll. And then I would come back to my desk giggling to myself because my work colleagues didn't know that I was in the toilet playing air guitar. And it would just change my emotional state. And it's only been of recent that I've realized that Tony Robbins actually talks about his psychological triad of changing one's emotional state, which is 3 elements, which is change your physiology, change your focus, and change your language. Now, when you're playing air guitar, you've got that physiology, you're changing it, you're rocking it out. My focus was very much that I was pretending like I was Kurt Cobain from Nirvana or Daniel Johns from Silverchair. And then I was just like, you are a rock star. So I'd actually use that theory without even knowing that it was a theory at that stage to change my emotional state when I was feeling depressed in this job that I found exceptionally unsatisfying.
I'm never gonna feel weird about doing air guitar in my car again.
Absolutely not. And once you get over that, I guess the embarrassment sometimes of I would find myself walking around just playing air guitar, at the office. Then I started not caring what people thought, because I was like, no, I'm managing my mental health. So I'd walk around just playing air drums or whistling. Whistling's a good one for changing your emotional state. And eventually, I got known as the quirky kind of guy, and I made more friends of it because I was fun. I wasn't just the guy sitting there feeling depressed anymore. I was starting to enjoy things and changing the way that I saw my life.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And you actually got to live your dream as well as being a rock star, because you are an award-winning songwriter and you've performed in front of like 10,000 people. How did
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, these are in my younger days when I was far better looking. But I was in this band that I guess we played 90s inspired kind of stuff. And they had a lot of competitions around for, young bands. And we sent in a demo and we got picked to be one of 7 state finalists here. And we went and performed in front of about 2,000 people in a stadium here in Melbourne, and they recorded that. And then from that recording, they chose us to be the state runner-up, and we got to perform at Rod Laver Arena here in Melbourne in front of 10,000 people. And that was a massive moment. It was one of those things that I'll probably never forget. And it ultimately that night changed the course of my life in many ways, because I don't know whether we've spoken about it, that John Trager is not actually my legal name. It's my business name that I use. But what happened that night, as a way of giving context, after that performance, it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I was sitting in a McDonald's with my mother, and this lady came over to me and she said, "Look, my daughters have just seen you perform and they think that you are amazing. Will you get your photo taken with them?" Now, these were like, I was 17, they were probably 17 too, 4 beautiful blonde girls. And you would think that, rock on, I am living the dream here. Here's my ego just exploding. But what actually happened was I felt like my privacy was being invaded. This was a moment for me just to be me. And here I had people, wanting a part of my private life. And that's where the character John Trager eventually come from, because I thought that if I could disconnect somehow, the performer from who I am, that once again, there would be a degree of security, because I was a sensitive guy. And I'm a huge John Cusack fan. And in the movie Serendipity, he plays the character Jonathan Trager. So I stole that straight away, and been John Trager since I was about 18 now.
Oh, fascinating. And it's interesting too that you would end up in a strip club working where people use different names to protect.
Absolutely. Yeah, and look, to add to that story, sidetrack from where we're really going, but why not add a little bit of extra color in, is when I was a small boy, we used to have some friends of the family who had a daughter, and we would go over to their house, and by the time we had to leave their house, my mother and her mother would have to come in and put all the clothes back on the Barbie dolls, because some reason I was obsessed with taking the clothes and leaving all the Barbie dolls naked. So then to end up working in a strip club maybe had connections to that moment too. Who knows? Freud would have a whole heap of things to say about that, I imagine.
All kinds of fun. That's super funny. I love your candor and being able to just like jump from one thing to another. So my friend, you have all these great stories, and you've done a lot of work on yourself, and you've done different training to become a certified coach. And so you have some exercises to share with us today to help with the emotional regulation and the silver lining.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, for me, I'm really passionate about people learning how to manage their emotions, because I think that if you can handle your emotions, then you can handle life. Because quite often what happens is it's the emotions that we're experiencing that makes us believe that we can't handle the scenario itself. It's not the scenario, it's the emotion. So if we can learn to emotionally regulate and manage our emotions and learn how to feel them through to completion, then ultimately we can handle life. So this is just a 4-step process, and it's so simple. You can do this anywhere you want to. But the first step is you have to learn how to language what it is that you're experiencing. And, that might be being able to name it down to shame or guilt. It might be giving it a color. Maybe it's the color brown. I'm feeling brown. It couldn't be a sound. I feel, but you need to be able to language it, because once again, this is now how we're going to teach ourselves to be able to identify what it is we're experiencing, and then be able to learn how to regulate that. And emotions are designed as fleeting things. And this is one of the things that I think is really important to create a distinction around, is that emotions are not facts. And quite often we'll make decisions based off emotions. But I think that if you really look at emotions, they're really just data, as we spoke earlier about perceptions and about tribal cycles, which is ultimately, the way we've observed our parents managing their emotions, the experiences that we've had, the meaning that we've allocated. The emotion that comes up from us is normally telling ourselves something. So for example, like when we're upset, there's normally 3 elements that will be part of feeling upset about something. And those 3 elements are normally, an intention that hasn't been fulfilled. You've set a goal and it hasn't worked, so you get upset about that. Maybe it's an expectation that hasn't been met. Maybe you get upset with this person for speaking to this other person a certain way because you don't believe they should treat that person that way. And so that expectation is created an issue in yourself. And also the other one is uncommunicated words. Like quite often we feel upset because we want to say something, but we haven't been able to say it. So when you recognize all of those 3 things come back to us. So when we're upset, it's not the other thing that's out there that's creating the upset. It's the upset in us from the meaning in which we've allocated to whatever the scenario is that we're experiencing. So the first thing you need to do is learn to language it. The second thing is, once again, taking that idea of accepting it. It's an emotion and it's okay. Quite often we get so scared of emotions and feel like, once again, that we can't handle them and, I have to suppress it. Once again, we use drugs and whatever it is, addictions like television, where we tune ourselves out so we don't have to focus on the emotion, but it's okay just to accept it. Absolutely. So just accept the emotion. The third thing is just to feel it. Whatever, if it's anger or whatever it is that you've labeled or language it, just feel it in your body and breathe. Because what will happen is eventually that emotion will not stay around. Emotions are fleeting and are designed as data to tell us how we feel about a certain experience. And then the fourth step is, as you're feeling it and you're just breathing it and you keep focusing on being mindful, eventually just let it go. And it's that simple. And I know that it sounds simpler because there'll be, possibly people that are viewing this are going, what, when I'm furious, I can't do that. But once again, I suggest go to the toilet, language it, accept it, feel it, and just let it go. And the important thing, I think, that in those moments when you have strong emotional reactivity, and this is where, for me over the years, I made so many bad decisions because of, treating emotions as fact and, no, you have done this to me, is you need to pause yourself. As soon as you feel that emotional reactivity coming up in you, don't say a word. I was in a situation, and once again, this is another wacky story, and I'll try to make it super quick. I was going through an experimental period in my life where I was exploring intimacy and sex and that kind of thing. And I found myself in a sex club, and I was in this spa, and I thought that my partner was the person that was being intimate with me, but I eventually realized that it was actually somebody sitting next to me. And that made me super furious because I was just like, how dare this person violate me? And so by that stage, I'd learned to just, okay, don't act, don't say anything. When you feel that strong emotional reactivity, shut your mouth. Do not do anything. Don't take any kind of actions, because that's the times that you say things that you're going to regret. You're going to do things that you end up going to beat yourself up over later. Shut things down until you can learn to emotionally regulate, go through those 4 steps, breathe. And for me, I got to that point where after being so furious and angry and I was going to put this person's teeth down the back of their throat, I said to myself, am I actually harmed? No, I'm embarrassed, but am I harmed? And this person hadn't harmed me. And by a couple of days later, I had once again another very funny story. And so, once you can get to that place of recognizing that it's really important to take yourself off automation, as I would call it, of just letting the emotion dictate the terms, become conscious and mindful. Okay, I'm experiencing strong emotion now. I need to remove myself from this situation, go through this process of feeling that emotion. And the important thing too is when you're accepting it, you need to recognize that, say, for example, your partner says something to you that makes you really, really angry. And you're like, how dare she say that? And you remove yourself from that situation. If you sit there and continue to ponder about what it is that your partner's in, you're going to keep experiencing that emotional reactivity within you, because it's those thoughts that are fueling the emotion. So it's important that you, when you go and take this exercise of removing yourself from the situation and going through languaging it, accepting it, feeling it, and letting it go, that you need to let go of what it is that you has caused the emotional reactivity.
No, that's all really great. And I definitely practice those sorts of things myself, and it makes such a difference to be able to have healthy relationships with people, platonically, like coworkers, in sexual relationships, whatever. Not those two things together, coworkers and sexual relationships. I don't know how to like, oh, that's just, yeah, that just sounds like a mess. Yeah, just the importance of transparency and telling somebody sometimes, I can't talk to you anymore about this because I am feeling myself becoming irrational, and I'm going to be mean, I'm going to lash out, wrong target, and that's not going to actually further our goal of being able to solve this problem. And sometimes people are like, well, I want to talk about it more. And you're just like, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I have to have this boundary, or maybe not even a place to say it. I'm sorry, maybe you just literally hang up on them because they keep pushing the boundary, and you know that that is not going to work. And then just like giving yourself the space to de-escalate, to come to a place of neutrality where you can look at what happened, like how much you need to take responsibility for, how much is actually them and what they're bringing to the table, and then come and try and have that conversation again.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you're in that place of and experiencing a strong emotion, our logical brain actually finds it far more challenging to be able to operate. And I like to use this example. There's a video, you can go on YouTube and check it out. Ben Affleck is talking to Sam Harris, and they're having a debate on a TV show. If you just chuck in Ben Affleck and Sam Harris, you'll find it, right? And they're discussing, I think it's something in relation to Muslim culture. And Sam Harris is talking, and Ben, says what he needs to say. But then as Sam starts to talk about his side, Ben Affleck starts to get more and more emotional, and then he can't control himself, and he no longer is actually he's not presenting any logical arguments, and he's no longer actually capable of debating. It's kind of fascinating as a case study to watch this, to show as we get emotional, how we can no longer really be logical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a parent, I know this from the standpoint of a teacher, since my master's degree is in education, is that when you're in front of children, sometimes it can be really frustrating when they have their meltdowns and you're trying to teach them something. But understanding how important it is for us to create that safe container and model for them what healthy emotional regulation looks like, what healthy conflict resolution looks like, and boundaries. And being able to just like hold that space with love and with integrity, because they'll have the best experience in the length of their life.
Absolutely. And I think children are a great teacher for that. I'd never had any experience with children, and had very much lived a rock and roll life of not wanting children or wanting that responsibility. And when my stepdaughter came into my life, she was such a teacher of those moments where, and this is kind of fascinating because I've now done workshops on the developmental stage of young people's minds and everything that's going on during that period. But, there'd be moments where it would perceive to me like, what did you do that for? Like, what were you thinking? And recognizing, okay, I just need to breathe here, slow everything down. And then I need to be able to go, okay, let's talk about what just happened here. Because, when you're on that automation process, you just respond off the emotion. And being able to use children, and I don't mean use children, but have children as our teachers of learning how to emotionally regulate. Adults are a walk in the park after you learn to emotionally regulate around children.
Yeah, it's another level of responsibility and accountability when you understand that oftentimes like the children are mirroring your behaviors.
Absolutely.
Like, I don't like what they're doing. Be like, oh, what have I been doing?
Oh, yes, yes. I am noticing that more and more in some of the language that I have. You know, my stepdaughter started saying things, and I'm like, oh, hang on. If you're going to go to that school, you probably shouldn't say those things. And recognizing how much imitation and mirroring is occurring, and that's how they're learning about the world.
Yeah, and as parents, how do people navigate all that without the shame, without the guilt, without the personal invalidation of like, I should do a better job, I'm failing, um, because it's still a relationship, you know, there's so much love and desire to give the best experience possible to your children. And then when they're
Absolutely.
hurting or they're struggling with X, Y, or Z, then how do you create that space, you know, and give them their autonomy to learn?
Absolutely. I think it's crucial.
Yeah. But also as a question, John, like as a step parent, how do you navigate that for yourself? Do you find yourself ever having those experiences, or are you able to recognize what they are and move forward in a way that you're not
Oh,
shaming?
look, I think that, you know, there wouldn't be a single parent in the world who's able to do that and emotionally regulate and be able to do that every moment of the day, because there's just so much that goes on in our busy lives and with, you know, the responsibilities of, you know, work and all of that kind of stuff. But it's one thing that I'm trying to do more and more often is become, once again, taking yourself off of automation and becoming conscious and mindful. And once you feel that emotional reactivity, being able to slow things down, and then ultimately looking, you know, my stepdaughter, then she'll go from a place of being highly emotional too, because, you know, I may have reacted or something, or her mother may have reacted, and then that causes emotional reaction in her. But by being able to slow things down for myself and not react, and it doesn't happen every time, but it's becoming more and more frequent that I'm getting better at this, I'm starting to notice then that she responds a lot more calmer to me, and then we're able to, you know, have conversations about things instead of her feeling judged or criticized or put down or any of those kind of experiences that she may be having. And, you know, for me, one of the things that's been kind of fascinating about having a child in my life now is recognizing, as we go back to the conversation we had earlier, about how quite often when we're talking to someone thinking that they understand the world the exact same way that we understand the world. And so when my stepdaughter come into my life, you know, I'm a bit of a, you know, a bit of a child myself, and I'd just like tease her, and sometimes she'd get a bit upset and be like, oh, and then I'd be like, oh no, what have I done? And after a little while of this, for me, I thought, you know, we're just having a bit of banter and fun. And because that was the dynamics between my friendships, which were based on shame, I guess, to a certain degree of shaming each other. And that was our affectionate way of, you know, connecting with each other. I stopped and for a moment, and I finally said to myself, and I asked her, I'm like, when I'm, you know, playing with you and teasing you like that, what is it that you perceive is going on? And she said, that you don't like me. And I didn't realize for a second, I could never have thought that she had interpreted what I was trying to be playful with as me not liking her. And so that's now made me a lot more conscious as to, okay, there's strong emotional reactivity going on. How are you perceiving this moment? And I'm finding that I'm also doing this in my adult relationships, where when people are reacting in a way that I'm not expecting, going, sorry, you know, can you please explain to me why you're feeling this way, or tell me what's going on for you? And coming from a place of curiosity rather than thinking I know what she's experiencing.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate you bringing that forward too. And I commend you in your journey in that. That's a lot. If anybody out there is listening, there's also a lot of work with Brene Brown. If you haven't listened to her
Yeah.
audiobooks, she is a shame researcher and she's amazing. Life-changing work listening to her books on Audible and reading them. And John, do you have anything else you would like to share about the silver linings aspects?
Yeah, so as I spoke before, you know, when I was talking about the early stages of searching for happiness and realizing that I had to reframe my thoughts, this was another strategy that I automatically picked up on, but didn't realize there was actually some positive psychology tools that had been created around this, but was recognizing that ultimately that my perspective was my choice and that I had to take responsibility for my perspective on something. So there's an exercise, and it's, once again, it's 4 steps steps of finding the silver lining in a situation. So the first step is just write down, because you've got to start learning how to use this muscle around gratitude and being able to find the positive things in life. So just start with 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for. It might be, you know, that your partner's a good cook. It might be the fact that you just got some really nice comfy socks that are amazing. You know, just start with small things, right? And the second thing is that when you've got a moment or a situation or a scenario that's unfolding that is quite unpleasant, just identify what that experience is. So I think this is a good exercise. You can do this consciously in your head, or you can write it down. I find writing's really good way of being able to get clear. Once you see the words on the page, you're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that's what was actually going on here. So just write down an experience that didn't go well for you. So the third step is then write down the negative aspects of that experience, because quite often we'll find those things straight away. You know, the negativity bias will kick in, which is basically our brain's primal urge for safety. And so we see the negative things in the world a lot clearer than we do the positive ones. And just write down a list of the negative experiences that come out of that. Now, the fourth step, this is where you need to reframe, is to look for the positive experiences. Because as I spoke about before, you know, when my partner cheated on me, I could have dwelled on the fact that she's cheated on me, I don't trust women, all of those things. But I focused on the fact that, okay, now I've got a fresh start. Now it's time for me to actually think about, what do I want in a relationship? And quite often, you know, we think that what we want is the opposite to what we don't want. And that's not the case at all. You know, for such a long period of time, I would always, every woman that I would date would be like the polar opposite to the one before. And I'd be just like jumping and jumping and jumping. And it wasn't until I sat down and gone, what are the qualities and what are the values in particular? This is the really important one. Like, what are the values of the person that I want to spend my life with? Well, I want someone who, you know, is compassionate. I want somebody who values freedom. And I started to be able to find those things. So finding the silver linings, the fourth thing is really write down the three things that are positive aspects of that. And I'll give everyone the first one. The first one in every situation is that everything that we experience is an opportunity for growth. You can learn something from it. People get so, you know, caught up in hindsight, like, they beat themselves up. If I'd done that differently or done that, but you do the best that you can in the moments with the knowledge that you have. Yeah. And it's great in hindsight to sit there and dwell on what you could have done, but you had to have that experience to get the hindsight to know what you should have done differently, which then automatically means that that experience had super value in it, which means that every experience that we have has super value. So there's the cheat for the first one. If you're making your list of 3 positive aspects, it is an opportunity to grow.
That's fantastic. Some really good exercises there for people to start working on. And it's about having grace in building your habit life, right? You're most likely not going to just jump out of the gate and be perfect at these different exercises, you know, and just like building that in and how you operate in the world to be able to have gratitude and reframe. And yeah, it's a really beautiful journey, but it can be incredibly transformative. So,
absolutely.
John, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you popping into the group and sharing your story and your wisdom. So hopefully it hits and helps some guys out there in the world. And where are some places that they can find you, and anything you'd like to promote in regards to the programs you run?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast or on the live video into the group. I'm really, really grateful. People can check me out at johntrager.com. Not only am I a coach, but I'm a songwriter and a podcaster, as we talked about. And on the 8th of August, I'm really super excited because I'm launching a live event called Unleash Your Inner Rockstar. And I'm taking that whole air guitar idea and I'm using it as a way for people to manage their mental health, to manage their physical health, and just to have fun. So the format will basically be that you'll be able to come on, and if you want to play air guitar, or maybe you want to play some air drums, or maybe you want to be a bit of a bass player, or maybe you're that person who stands in front of the mirror with their hair comb and likes to sing, or maybe you just want to dance and be part of the crowd. The live shows will ultimately be 5 songs in which you can rock out as hard or as soft as you want. And in between the songs, we'll do it like interval training, where after each song of you rocking out and being cool and, you know, focusing like you're a rock star, we'll just slow things down, get your heart rate down before the next song. So it will be for not only physical health, but mental health. And at the end of the show of the 5 songs and that, then we'll have a guest speaker on that will do probably 10 to 15 minutes of personal development related speech. So that starts on the 8th of August, johntrager.com. Check that out. There'll be more details up there very, very shortly.
Fantastic. I'm excited. I hope some of the guys pop in there and I can hear more about it later.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything quite like that before, so that sounds fun. So gentlemen, thank you again so much for watching, and we will see you later. Bye.
Bye.